Hi, everyone. I am with Angel Rubio once again. We just finished recording in Spanish, and that got so good. It actually took about 30 minutes. That's gonna be a good one. I hope you can my English speaking viewers. You're gonna have to learn Spanish because it got really good on that one. No. We're gonna make a summary of what we just discussed. We've been discussing for about 30 minutes what we think is happening, what has happened, what is happening, and what could be the current turmoil of these decisions of the tariffs. Welcome, Angel.
Thank you, Gabriel. Thank you for inviting me. And yeah, lovely discussion. I think we can still discuss even further in
Well,
English
there's
now.
no ending on this, right? Because it just gets
Yeah,
good.
that's true.
We start touching certain subjects. So the first thing that I want to say is we're going to talk about the tariffs and we're going to talk about the imports in January and February. And
Sure.
and why do I mention what we're going to talk about is so that stay tuned because the tariffs are coming. But before the tariffs, I started with one question. I said, Angel, January and February were record high months, or they were much higher than what they had been in the past. What's going on? People were importing. People knew that the tariffs were coming. They anticipated.
I mean, yes. I mean, there's definitely an element of that. I think a lot of people were also trying to beat some of the tariffs, but they're also competing with. There are several things, right? Let's just begin with that. Second half of 2024, lots of importers trying to clean out or rebuy or restock into the second half of the year. Normally that doesn't happen, right? Normally you restock when India's coming out or throughout the year with Ecuador because of the cycles, etc. But inventories were relatively thin, if you can say. I'm not saying that thin, like, oh, there's no inventory. There is inventory. There was inventory. It's just like they needed to restock, come into the Q4 and into Q1 of the following year, which is very normal because you still have to hold inventory for the following year. At least in the US, this happens, right? Whether it's Chinese New Year or like Easter or like the Lent season, and so on and so forth. During this restock, the same happened in Europe and in China. So everybody's bidding those numbers higher. And that means that relative to what you were saying to before in your previous clips is that essentially we got rid of a lot of the old inventory from 2022, from 2023 into early 2024. So to answer your question, also 2024 imports in 2024 in January and February in 2024 last year, they were like
Oh,
comparatively low to all the previous years
2023.
too. So what happens in 2025 now? These numbers coming really strong as people are restocking ahead of the tariff, restocking from cleaning previous inventories. China and Europe are buying, so that raises the price. You come in, all these numbers are high relative to 2024, but they're not crazy high relative to 2023, and obviously not relative to 2022, right? They're
Okay.
almost on par.
All right, but I'm gonna simplify this a little bit. We talk so much that I am learning to understand Angel, which is a lot. Is a lot. I'm glad I'm learning. Basically, there was all of 2024, there was people who were thinning their inventory. They had inventory and they were trying to be leaner and get rid of that inventory throughout 2024. By the end of 2024, people had actually accomplished a leaner inventory, right? But at the same time that Asia did it and that Europe did it. So everybody said, oops, too thin on my inventory. I need to replenish inventory, and everybody stepped in. That's why the price increased in July, August, September, and October of last year.
Correct.
Is specifically more towards September, October, and November of last year is when prices
Yes.
really
Yes.
increased.
Yes.
Raw material around the world, everywhere increased. That gave the farmer a breather, and that's a good thing. But when people thin down their inventories, this year, January, there's two things going on. Number one is people are buying to get ahead of the possible tariffs because nobody knew that they were going to be this serious, this quick, and this important.
And to everyone and to
And
everything.
to everyone, exactly. Everybody was hoping, oh, I hope it's the other guy. No, here's everyone. Here's your list, guys. You're
And
all together.
all products. All
Yeah.
products.
and all products are in the same bag. So that was something people weren't expecting. So people were rebuilding their inventory to a better inventory position because they realized that everybody was going short on inventories, but now there are disruptions in shipping lines. We had that strike in New York. Ecuadorians had the light issue, the energy issue
Oh yeah,
in
yeah.
October that disrupted a little bit
Oh
supply.
yeah, the port strike. The port strike was huge too. Like we forgot to mention that, but the port strike was super important because it was January 15th, so everybody wanted to have everything in house before January 15th.
So people were trying to beat it. So a lot
Sure.
of reasons why people were wanting to buy. What's important of this is people wanted to buy, but the supply is there.
Exactly.
People want to buy,
Yes.
but the supply is there. Because if people wanted to buy and supply wasn't there in a January, which is usually not the big month for anyone, January is not a big month for anyone. There's very
Prices
few
would have spiked.
prices in
Prices
the
went up, but they didn't
exactly.
spike.
And exactly. So there was a feeling of an increase, but nothing too bad happened, nothing too big happened. And that's great.
Manageable.
The supply was there, and that's a good to me, that's a good thing. That means that even though there's demand, and the discussion we were having is this demand is for replenishing inventory. So this is not real demand. Well, it is because once you
Yes.
replenish and you build that inventory, that's your new level of inventory, and that's what you are feeling comfortable with moving forward. What
Correct.
happened in I keep on talking about those sad 18 months before July of 2024 when prices were terrible to the farmer is because
Yes.
during 18 months people had long inventories and they were doing the opposite. They were thinning inventories. So you don't need to go out and buy, you need to buy less because you need to sell more. So you need to
Correct.
lower your inventory. So then
Correct. Correct.
then you are dulling demand because you are trying to eat up and you're trying to be thinner.
But there was an over. That is what we call it. It's an overcorrection. The
Exactly.
overcorrection wasn't huge, but there was an overcorrection, right? Simple as
Absolutely.
that.
Now that left, so we lived through holes in inventories in November, lived through that caused prices to increase. We are talking about an equilibrium in the market. We discussed it
Yes. Yes.
in the NFI conference in January. We discussed this also in the Shrimpcast, the first edition of the Shrimpcast of 2025. And then now there is something called uncertainty in the market and uncertainty in
Yes.
life. This is uncertainty. What do people do? It's impossible to give a verdict because last week was one plan. During 7 days we were planning and doing, and okay, so how we're going to adjust to that tariff. And
Yeah.
then now there's a new tariff which is a level playing field. But
Correct.
what's
It's just
going on?
10%.
People are going crazy. Everybody has to talk with their customers, with their sources, readjust. Um, what happens with everything you had bought and you owe? People take commitments, right?
Correct. So I think so. This is not about. This is not an opinion, right? I'm just trying to tell you the summarized version of what I'm collecting, and I'm collecting from producers, meaning like packers and farmers, the importer in the U.S. and the customer, right? Your retailer or your restaurant group. And it's obviously it's the widespread consensus is that it's very uncertain, but it's also when there's this level of uncertainty, there's no big positions. Like there's not like a huge position on a buy or like a big contract or like a or like setting the price or anything like there's not a lot of big positions. And what are they looking at? They're looking at prices, right? Like prices are going to be giving you those signals. But for example, a lot of the Packers position is like, well, importer, you're gonna pay the 10%. You're gonna have to pay the 10%. And I don't think that that's gonna be the case for everyone, right? There's gonna be like 80-20 terms or something like that, right? There's gonna be some negotiations there. And the same thing from importer to the next, right? So you're not gonna pass the entire 10% to all your customers. You're gonna pass 10% to some customers, you're gonna pass 6% to other customers, and so on and so forth. So there's some negotiations happening. A lot of this hasn't ended yet. They're still in some of these negotiations. Some bigger contracts need bigger firms, right? If you are a big retailer, your probably is like, no, we talk about this. Why? Because I cannot pass 10% to my consumer right now, right? There's like one
Yeah,
of the biggest retailers
10,
went out
15,
and said
20,
that.
whatever your number is, right? But you know what? I just was thinking of this one thing, and I think this is the one good comment of you were saying people are going to negotiate the tariff and they're going to try and negotiate and say, okay, how are we splitting it?
Yes.
Depending on how important the US market is for you and how because there are other markets in the world. So how
Yeah.
are we splitting? Well, if it's 20% of my business that is going to have a tariff, how are we splitting it? In our case, 80% of our sales are elsewhere. How are we splitting it? Is elsewhere remains identical because they are what they are. That means the
Yeah.
raw material prices remain identical. That means that this is the price of shrimp in this country plus 10% or plus X percent. So there's no splitting in a case where it's a very low percentage.
But I do
Yeah,
think that if you're well diversified, you're 30, 30, and 30, then you're probably going to negotiate like, I don't know, okay, I'll eat 7%, you'll eat the other 3%, or something like that.
yeah, yeah.
But unequivocally, I don't think this is up for discussion. This is like what's going to happen. It's like prices are going to go up no matter what you do, right?
Oh yeah,
Prices
immediately.
at the very end,
They already went up.
right? But
They
you're
already
gonna
went up.
pass those prices, they're gonna be passed on along the supply chain.
That's kind of clear. They already went up. They're going to keep on going up to adjust. We don't know what the tariff is. We don't.
Correct.
Today we're playing with 10%, but we don't know what the tariff is. We don't know if in 90 days tariff will be 10, 15, 20, if it's going to be the same for everyone or if it's going to be differentiated. We have no clue.
Yeah.
And that's the whole problem. It's uncertainty, right? So what do
Yes.
we do? I don't
You don't make commitments. You don't even make commitments with your bank. I mean, and your bank is probably going to be like, "Oh, am I going to get paid? Should I raise my interest rates or the level of risk? Given the level of risk, I'm going to require a higher rate. I don't know.
So, but eventually that turns into you don't make large commitments. That turns into thinner inventories once again. So
Possibly. I mean,
people have the inventories from January and February, which were high purchase months, high
yes.
import months. So there's shrimp in the country right now. That can probably hold a bit, and we have 90 days, which I'm guessing, of course. What do you think is going to happen, Angel, in these 90 days with your import numbers?
Not, yeah. I mean, but in 90 days, I mean, prices are going to continue. I mean,
But you have to get that product into the country quickly. So you have
so
to
I
try
have
to
an
get it.
example, right? Because we never had an example for this because countervailing duties and anti-dumping duties are revised backwards. So a lot of this is already in the price. You don't know. It might have been like
It
5,
doesn't affect
6%,
it
whatever.
because it goes backwards. So
Exactly.
in the countervailing duties, it's well done so that you can't exceed 10% of your previous exports.
So
There's
there
a
you
limit.
go. So you're kind of tapped, and it's priced in. But
All right.
what I wanted to say is that during Trump 1, tilapia was taxed like a big item. Tax like tilapia was taxed first 15, then 25. So eventually the dust settled at 25. What we saw during that time is that prices, and this is where it gets really really interesting, because prices shot up more than 25%, because a lot of that was part of the pandemic too, and so on and so forth. And there was and swai got into FSIS, swai, which is an alternative species, not a substitute direct. But what we did is we tried to do it a little bit like a clinical trial, like a drug trial. It's like what happens with tax, without tax, with pandemic, with no pandemic. And what we found out is that after the dust settled and everything came down, that tilapia, that 25% of tariffs got passed on in its entirety. So that 25% got passed on to the wholesaler and to the consumer. 25%, that's it. You pass it all along.
And
Yes, it did.
it
It
did.
did, and it fell hard. It fell like 30%. I think for tilapia, it's for every 10%. I think for every 10% that you pass on to the retailer passes 6% to the consumer. So like minus 4% or something like that. But what I'm
Okay.
trying to say is that demand contracted significantly, right? So we had 30% less frozen fillets of tilapia. That's not necessarily just because of price or because of the tariff. There's other factors in there, right? This is what we do in econometrics. How much can be explained with this? And it was about 60%, which is a very good. Remember your statistics classes,
Yeah.
your R square. So our R square was about 0.66. what this tells us is like there's still another 34% that we cannot explain why demand went down or why imports went down. And that could be for bad publicity or another species, whatever. That's not what I'm trying to say. The thing is that I did this for shrimp. And what we found is that at a very high level, my R square was 0.71, is that for every 10% change in price, okay, stay with me. For every 10% change price, up or down, okay?
Yep.
Consumption goes the opposite way
Opposite. Yeah.
by 3%. This means that also if prices go down by 10%, you can see an increase in consumption by 3%. Now, these prices have to get translated to the consumer. The thing is that wholesale prices to retail prices have a cap. So even if prices for shrimp go down 10%, that doesn't mean that prices to consumer get passed on there.
Drop that 10%. Correct.
So within that threshold, we found that consumption. So the risk here is that if prices go up by 20, 30%, you will see a contraction in consumption, whether you like it or not, because these prices will get passed on to the consumer. There's the risk there in the long run, because that happens maybe like 11, 12 months later. So that you see, there's time to wiggle here, some wiggle room with time. Does that make sense?
Yep, absolutely. No, Angel, I have high hopes and great wishes that the Global Shrimp Council and their efforts to educate and improve knowledge of shrimp in the consumer's minds
There's the other. Yes.
helps mitigate if there are those price increases which could affect consumption.
Of course, we want to affect demand, right? With the campaigns, we want to affect demand that we haven't, and we need to do that.
Absolutely. My friend, thank you so much. It's been a great set of questions, answers, and discussions. I always enjoy it. All right, my friend, take care.
Thank
You
you.
very much.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.